When John was first given the vision, known as the Revelation, the angel, Jesus Christ, both sent it and signified it. As we explained in earlier videos, to signify means to make known by signs, speech, action. In the case of Revelation, the vision was given by means of symbolic representation. Everything in Revelation is a sign or symbol which represents the things which would shortly come to pass. John is following the practice of all ancient prophets who, as Joseph Smith explained, saw images or figures of beasts and other things, but not the actual beasts themselves. The figures, images, or signs that John uses, like all prophets, are the archetypes of the polar configuration. As we interpret the verses of chapter 12, we will follow a three-layered approach. The first layer are the figures exactly as John described them. These will always be archetypes borrowed from the polar configuration. Layer 2 will be the physical layer behind the figures, the planets and associated phenomena which gave rise to the archetypes. The third and final layer will be the interpretation. That is, what John intended the figures and signs to represent. Chapter 12 begins with the appearance of an unusual woman in heaven. The woman, clothed with the sun and with starry crown, is the quintessential mother goddess, which was always associated with the planet Venus. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we need to compare the Bible's version with Joseph Smith's inspired restoration. The woman is no longer a wonder, though she certainly was. Instead, she is a sign. The woman is a symbol meant to represent things on the earth. We learn in the verse that the woman was specifically intended to represent the Church of God. This clue is provided by Joseph's version and not the biblical translation. At this point, we have identified the first and third layers of the image of the woman. The second layer requires further explanation. Certainly, the woman, the mother goddess, was an archetype derived from the only female planet in the polar configuration, Venus. We can definitely make that connection. But there is more to the statement by John. To begin with, John states that the sign simply appeared in heaven. In other words, the sign had not been there before. Just as the sign of the Son of Man was the appearance of one or two comets, so too the woman signified the appearance of one of those cometary bodies near Earth. Venus will be the second planet of the polar configuration to return. Mars will return earlier as Wormwood and Apollyon. The woman will have a crown of 12 stars upon her head. In its cometary phase, Venus had brilliant plasma streamers extending outward. To Earth-bound observers, Venus looked like a radiating star. It became the archetypal great star. These same streamers form the star crown upon the head of the warrior hero Mars. Though the configuration was primarily interpreted to be the crown of the hero, the same was true of Venus. The streamers became the crown of the goddess herself. The goddess became the queen of heaven. Or, in John's revelation, this crown will become the crown upon the head of the woman clothed in the sun. At times, the streamers became very thin with bulbs at the end. Now, this explains some representations of the woman with similar bulbs. John described the woman as clothed with the sun. This analogy refers to the woman's radiance, which John compares to the brightness of the sun. Anciently, the cometary Venus was renowned for its dazzling brightness. Like John, the ancient Chaldeans compared the planet to the sun and described it as a bright torch in the heavens. According to the Chinese, Venus was visible during broad daylight. The comet's brightness rivaled the sun. The Assyrians described Ishtar, meaning Venus, in a similar manner as John. Ishtar was clothed with fire and wore a brilliant crown. Inanna, the Sumerian version of the Venetian goddess, was lauded in poetry for her resplendent light. It was as if she was clothed in radiance. Venus, when in its cometary phase, was ablaze with light, rivaling the sun in brightness. This will be the case when the planet returns to Earth as a comet. As Joseph Smith described it, Venus will grow larger and larger as it approaches the Earth, and when it reaches our planet, it will be in a blaze, lighting up the sky like the sun. The woman stood upon what John calls the moon. Iconographically, the most common representation of the moon is a crescent. But there are representations with the moon itself, often with a crescent to identify the orb as the moon. Historically, there was never any question about the identity of the moon under the feet of the Queen of Heaven. It was a crescent which appeared on the face of Saturn. The moon we see today was not a part of the polar configuration.
In our previous episode, we observed the critical role of a great crescent in the ancient sky. The placement of this crescent on the sphere of an enigmatic body called the primeval sun is one of the unresolved mysteries of the ancient world. The first step in a resolution must be to honor the early historic descriptions of things not seen in our sky today. The crescent had nothing to do with our moon, and the great sphere on which the crescent appeared certainly was not our sun. It was the sphere of the gas giant Saturn, appearing as a massive body visually dominating the sky. Yes, today's sun was present. It was the sun that cast the illuminated crescent on the towering form of Saturn.
With this in mind, our physical layer becomes more complete. As a protection from the dragon, who was threatening her, the woman fled into the wilderness. She went to a place of protection prepared for her by God. The woman was given 2 wings of an eagle to assist her in her flight to her place. Church and biblical scholars normally jump into interpretation of what the flight of the woman means, especially as representing the church. They do so without first establishing the physical layer of the symbol. However, before any symbol can be properly understood, especially the symbols of the apocalypse, the symbol itself must be understood. To understand the Shakespearean analogy of a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, it is necessary to understand what a rose is in the first place. The flight of the woman into the wilderness is a description of the movements of Venus guised in symbolic clothing. Venus, as the woman, moves away from the earth, flees, and wanders through space, called the wilderness, reaching a specified location designated as her place, which will become the sacred enclosure of the gods. The wings of the woman are the arcs of the crescent of Saturn, previously called the moon under her feet. These movements will not be the first time. They follow a scenario played out in ancient times. At the death of the hero, the goddess cried aloud and went in search of her dead child or lover or husband. The death of the hero was an ancient interpretation of the descent of Mars along the axis mundi during catastrophic times. It is the same movement and conditions that John saw, which he interpreted first as the birth of the man-child and then as the descent of the hero into the belly of the beast, or the land of the dead, hell. At his death, the mother goddess was disconsolate to the point that she wandered the heavens in search of him. The Egyptian Isis wandered the world searching for the remains of Osiris. The Greek Electra, mourning the destruction of Troy, was separated from her sisters and lamented with streaming hair. This preserves the cometary aspect of the lamenting goddess. At the death of Adonis, Aphrodite loosened her hair, again the image of the comet, and went wandering through the woodlands, the Greek version of John's wilderness. She shrieked as she went, meaning the planet made loud, shrill noises as it traversed the heavens. A phase of the search of the goddess included her descent towards the earth. Aphrodite, upon learning of the death of Adonis, threw herself from the rocks of Leucas. The white rock of Leucas, where Zeus sits, is the top of the world mountain, the axis mundi. Venus descended from atop this mount, giving rise to the mythic tale. The Canaanite Anat searched for Baal everywhere, only to find him when she descended to the underworld herself. The cometary goddess took the form of a bird in her search for the hero, just like John's woman was given wings of an eagle. Isis, during her search for Osiris, took the form of a swallow and flew around the pillar which contained the body of the king. The Irish version of the goddess flew to and perched upon the dying hero in the form of a crow. While Aphrodite did not take the form of a bird, she did go to the dead Adonis on a chariot of swans. Hesiod, in his Metamorphosis, recorded the story, calling the goddess Venus. One scholar has suggested that part of the goddess movements as a bird were circular. The myth of Isis and Osiris supports this conclusion. At one point, after having found Osiris encased in a pillar, Isis transforms herself into a swallow, flying around the pillar. The pillar, of course, is the axis mundi, the world tree. The movement may have been more of a spiral if the planet ascended the axis mundi while circling around it. The woman with the wings of an eagle flying through the wilderness will generally repeat the movements and actions of the lamenting goddess of antiquity. In Revelation, the flight of the woman as a bird is not in search for her dead son or lover. Rather, the woman is fleeing from the serpent to a place of safety. The final resting place for the woman was called her place. The wording suggests that the place was a specific location. In physical terms, this would mean that Venus will travel to a specific position in space. But her place is more than just a location. It was prepared for her by God. John does not describe the place, let alone identify it. Fortunately, the ancients knew the place and recorded it in their myths and legends. Her place was the motherland created by the serpent itself. It was the home of the gods and heroes.
From the episodes of disorder, a phase of celestial construction emerged, focused on the activity of the spiraling form, or rayed spiral, remembered as the serpent of creation. This was the expanded enclosure of the mother goddess herself, the motherland in the sky, the true subject of the archaic creation legend. The mythic home of gods and heroes lay within an enclosure formed by the body of the celestial serpent or dragon.
It may seem contradictory that the place that was prepared of God to protect the woman was an enclosure formed by the dragon itself. However, we must remember that the cometary Venus was both the woman and the dragon. If the woman is to have her place prepared for her, then this also presumes that the protective enclosure of antiquity will be restored. It also means that Venus will recreate the enclosure as before in a similar fashion. Unlike the ancient myths, John does not describe the process. He merely states that her place was prepared. It is to the enclosure that the man-child returns when he ascends to heaven. We know from John that the enclosure will be built, since he describes it in later chapters. The woman's place will be specifically designed to nourish the woman. Anciently, the circular enclosure was the Garden of Eden, where food was plentiful. When it is formed again at the apocalypse, it will again be like the garden, with the tree of life and its bounty. The symbolic structure looks like this.